Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Dan Mielke. In this episode, we dive into the world of what Science 7 and 8 look like with an educator who's reimagining the science classroom. Imagine walking into a science classroom where students are standing, collaborating at whiteboards, tackling real-world problems, and generating their own assessment questions. A place where being wrong is a step towards deeper learning. From exploring real-world questions that ignite curiosity to making curricular connections, to just-in-time assessments that invite authentic understanding, join us as we continue to explore Dan's journey into the thinking classrooms in science. Let's rejoin the conversation. Welcome to Northeast Voices, a podcast that spotlights the innovators and change-makers in education. We're here to share the stories of inclusion, empowerment, and the impactful connections with the Northeast School Division and beyond, focusing on the pivotal role of students, families, and teachers. Join us as we dive into the conversations revealing the strategies and moments shaping the future of education. NEVoices is your platform for inspiration and connection, and is recorded in the Northeast School Division, sharing the land of Treaties 4, 5, 6, and homeland of the Métis in Northeast Saskatchewan. Be sure to subscribe and join our community of innovators and changemakers. Let's get started. Before we go any further, because you've listed several great questions that we're going to dig into, if we were to come into your classroom to open the door into grade 7 science in semester 1 or into grade 8 science, what would we see that we might not expect or might be slightly different?
There would be times where you would come in and it would not be really discernible from a lot of science classrooms, because some of the work is really subtle, right? When I first read Lilladal's book, some of it was really overwhelming, right? That you think you've got to make this and one of the first 3 is some significant physical changes. But actually, a lot of the time, and I'll come back to that, it's similar. However, there would be times when you would come in, especially at the beginning of a concept, would be really critical, or it could come if there was a misunderstanding unearthed through some formative assessment, right? That's happened where I'll look at some formative work or just observation, as you mentioned, right? That formative, organic, observing what students are doing, and you go, okay, this is a barrier, right? And that's why also your pieces grow, your navigation tools grow, where you go, oh, I didn't think about that, but that is something we need to be able to do. But you would see students up, standing, which is one of Lilladal's big 3, working on non-permanent vertical surfaces. So that's huge. And when you read the book, the really powerful thing about Lilladal's book is he really, I don't want to say attacks, that's not the word I want, but attends to some of the FAQs. So do they really have to be standing up? Do I really have to go out and buy whiteboards? And he says, yep, and here's why, right? It's not just because I think it's cool or that's my brand. It's, no, my research showed me. And so the other day, as an example, we started our piece on buoyancy and buoyant forces with a group problem. And we do that lots. And one area where I don't want to say strayed, but I have not adhered to Lilladal as tightly is my problems are vaguely curricular. And I say that because years ago, I learned when you're doing a problem-based learning or that kind of work is the outcome doesn't have to be the end. The outcome can be part of the journey. And so that's how I've designed my group problems is they are vaguely curricular so that they land on the outcome as part of the journey, but it might not be the end. So the solution to the problem might not be the outcome. So in the case of this one, they had sunken treasure. And so part of my reason for using it was those transferable skills of following directions, collaborative thinking, problem solving. And so I complicated it by saying it was really deep. And so you can't just run a rope down to the treasure chest and haul it up. You also can't open the treasure chest because you don't know what's in it. And so I took away some easy answers and left them with some really challenging scenarios. And what was really funny is I had 5 groups, 4 of them broke the rules because they worked, and ultimately they're like, I'm hooking a rope and pulling it up. And I'm like, well, okay, you can't, and like you're disqualified. But one group, it was funny, was stumped. And so they said, okay, we'll tie it to a whale and the whale can pull it to the surface. And I said, okay, obviously not something we would do, but what if I told you that was not totally wrong? And then so all the groups erased and started over with that starting point, right? And so eventually some of the groups got to the idea of we could float it to the surface. And so then they start asking questions, which is the really cool piece, right? Where they start talking in a group about like, how would we fill the balloon? What would we put in the balloon? How big would the balloon have to be? Would we want more than one balloon? And those are the questions that I then springboard off of. So that's what you might see that's different is you might walk in see on the board that we're today's learning outcome is I can explain Archimedes' principle and buoyant forces. And we're talking about tying a whale to a treasure chest. And so if you didn't stay for the whole thing, you might be like, I'm not really sure how we got from point A to point B. But what's really cool is it creates, if we all go back to our old ed psych days, when we learn new stuff, we have to hang it on scaffolding that we've pre-built. And for some students, something like Archimedes' principle or buoyant forces, or even like contact forces in general, don't have that immediate structure to hang it on. And so what's really cool about Lilladal's problems, you can create those discrepant events to hang it on, right? So now when we review buoyant forces, I'll say, remember when we were going to tie the treasure chest to the whale and how that was silly, but it wasn't as crazy as we thought. It creates that hook in that learning. And so then we go from there. And so as a follow-up to, like I said, it might be in the middle of learning, as we started to talk about Archimedes' principle and getting into it, it became obvious that the students didn't really understand displacement method of finding volume, right? Like we had done it, we'd done it in a lab. They didn't really make that connection. And so I actually literally gave them the Archimedes story. And I said, you are Archimedes, the king has brought you the crown. He wants to know if it's pure gold. You have everything you need to solve this problem. Go for it. And so then they spent a lot of time in groups, again, playing with that. And then we actually came back together as a whole group because I said, lots of times our problems don't have an answer.
Right.
This one does. And we want to honor that, right? So now we're going to put our ideas together and we're going to honor our thinking, but we're also going to recognize the fact that Archimedes did have a methodology that worked. And that would be what you'd see is different. You'd see kids up and working. In labs, you'd see a lot of collaborative problem solving. And then what's strange is you'd see them go away. So they work in this little bustle, but then they go away to finish. And they know that's because the assessment has to be individual. You start to build those pieces in that they know we can collaborate all we want up to this point. And then when I say this is the part I need submitted, they know they need to go away and they need to work on that independently. What's cool is you start to see organic things happening, like when they're problem solving, they quickly realize this isn't a competition. So there's no harm in asking another group what they're doing. But I purposely do not tell them that, right?
Right.
So they'll come and say, is it okay if we ask another group? And I'll be like, I don't care. But is that kind of cheating? I said, like, why do you think it's cheating? Shouldn't we come up with this on our own? No, that is actually not a transferable skill, right? Working in isolation is not a skill you need to learn, right?
And working with your colleagues is a skill that's very important, and pooling those ideas and coming together. I like that you talked about honoring the different ideas. So what is the work that we've done? Do you find, or this is a question that I'm wondering, do you find that students know that there's in a point where it needs to be individual assessment? But up until that point, are they starting to engage with each other more and ask each other more questions to clarify their own understanding so that they know that they're ready to be able to demonstrate it at a deeper level?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to some of Lilladal's work, is where he says always use random groups, which has been really powerful because it forces students to work with a lot of different people. And yeah, they can't rely on, when you read his book, he talks about the natural roles that students will take on. I think he talks about the actor who pretends they're engaged. And so what happens is when you mix up the groups all the time, nobody gets comfortable in a role and everybody has to contribute. That's one of the rules too, is everybody has to touch the marker. That's a bit harder to monitor, but
Right.
it's pretty easy, pretty quick to see the kid who's like not touching the marker. And you can literally physically go over and hand them the marker. And it's, I would say more than not for sure, that kid had something to add, right? And they just, when I force them, it's not their fault anymore if it's wrong. It's my fault because I
Right.
made them, and I'm okay with that. And so, yeah, they definitely, and what's really cool is they'll start to ask each other, right? Because again, when I was taking my teacher training, we called it the hidden curriculum. Now
Right.
we just call it transferable skills. The idea of reading instructions and being able to follow instructions. So I'm big on, they'll ask me a question, I'll say, that's in the instructions. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, I know I read it, but I don't understand. And clarifiers are good. Clarifiers and safety are good questions.
Right.
But even better, if it's a clarifier, I might say, have you asked everyone in your group and have you checked with that group because they're doing it? Right? I'll say, look
Yes.
around. If you're not sure how to do step 3, look at a group who might be doing it because I bet you they have some insight for you. And once you remove that competitive thing, then everybody's willing to help everybody. Like you'll hear them talk at, a station with a chemical of how much did we need again? Oh, right. We only need that much. Or you hear them say, no, don't pour it back into the bottle, right? Just pour it into another container. And so you start to see some really cool things where, yeah, they are definitely co-learning and collaboratively learning, which is awesome.
And exciting for future skills because we know creative thinking and critical thinking and that innovative thinking that we want to work towards comes from the ideas that you generate with each other. It comes from having that think time on your own to process it and then take that idea back to a group and keep working through that. So I think that's exciting. That shift is it's not a competition. We're all actually here to help each other. And that idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. We all have something to contribute, and that makes a difference to all of us. So that's what we see when we go into the classroom. When you had mentioned earlier the shift from, and I think we had a conversation about this. I think it was students said to you, do we have to have an exam on this or do we have to have a test on this? Do you want to talk us through a little bit about that?
Sure, and actually a big part of that was, I'd start with what happened to me. So that would have been my greatest level of discomfort, right? As I went in knowing that probably this new way of doing things didn't lend itself well to a quiz at the end. So if I was asking students to do all these things around thinking, to then really collapse it down to answering questions seemed a little bit like I was pulling the rug out from under them, right? Like, I want you to take risks. And that's a big thing. We talk about leaps of learning where I want you to take a risk, right? And being wrong is way better than not trying. And
Yeah.
that's where I really drill that home with them that like being wrong is totally cool. Not trying is unacceptable. And so to then give them just a standard exam was really tough, right? But both me and the student ended up having the same question. So the student should say, "Are we having an exam?" And I would say, I don't think so. Why? Do you want an exam?" "No." "But why did you ask?" "How will I know if I've learned it?" And in my brain, the little voice in my head saying, "I have that question too,"
Mm.
right? I had to really quickly get okay with there's not going to be a point in time where I can say this event told me that you understood it, right? It had to become in the moment events. And then that challenged me as an educator to create assessment items that were aligned with how we had learned. But I still ultimately had to say at some point, they're there or they aren't or they're beyond. And it's
Right.
definitely a learning curve for me around how do I do that? And what really cool that came out of it is what's really cool that came out of it is I I know what they need to be able to do. That's where Lila Doll's navigation tool came into play. How they show me, I'm not always sure about when we start the journey. So sometimes it happens in the middle of a lab. A student will ask me a question and I'll go, "What? If we could answer that question, that would tell me that you know this really well. Let's answer that question and hand it in." Right? So suddenly it will become like the next day I'll say to them, "Okay, so at the end of today, I'm going to give you this question that so and so brought up, and I'm going to collect it and I'm going to mark it." And the reason that listeners might be wondering why wouldn't you just give them the question? I still do want to give them the support of a rubric to guide when it's summative like that, to guide the thinking, right? So we'll go back to the outcome, we go back to the NESD rubrics, and we go back to Lila Dahl's work in that navigation tool, and we start to pull it all together, right? And so then I can create a little mini rubric to go with it so as an example, we were doing a lesson the other day and I'm just trying to think exactly how everything rolled out. So we were talking about buoyant forces. Oh, yeah, we were talking about buoyant forces. And the question that came at the end of it was, so why did the Titanic? And so to complicate their thinking, because right away, if you like, I always tell them, like, we can talk for a few seconds, but this is summative. So we're not going to get into answers. I want
Right.
you to do it on your own. One of the students said, it got heavier. And I said, that's a cool thought, except I said, we talked about the Edmund Fitzgerald. And I said, so the Edmund Fitzgerald would have been heavier full than the Titanic was even full of water. Yet the Edmund Fitzgerald floated until it also filled with water and then it sunk, right? And so then the summative piece became, tell me why the Titanic sunk, right? And then the rubric guides them, right? That's why I take that day because the rubric will say, here's what I need you to pull into that answer, right? I need you to talk to me a little bit about buoyant forces. I need you to talk to me about density. I need you to talk to me about Archimedes' principle. And what's really cool is that's a student generated question. And
Yes.
so then I can use that to assess their learning. In grade 7, we did a really cool lab around using chocolate to explain the rock cycle and the idea
Right.
of the ever-changing earth. And one of the kids said to me, "I could use this to explain it to my little cousin." And I was like, "And if you could do that, it would tell me you really understood it." And so then their summative piece was, how would you use this experience to explain the rock cycle to a 5-year-old? And so sometimes there's pieces that are predetermined and the
Right.
day they get the lab, it's there, but it can be really organic too, where it's coming out of the students. But I couldn't do that if I was locked into a quiz at the end. I mean, I know listeners might say you could pull those questions together and make a test, but it's still, so part of what we do is called just-in-time learning. And I think there's also just-in-time assessment where, because you're asking me that question, tells me you're thinking about it. And
Right.
that's a really cool way for me to check in. And again, when you're using the navigation tool, you can see that piece of, do they have to be able to fully answer why the Titanic sunk? No. But in the course of trying, can they touch on the topics we need to and show me that beginning or intermediate proficiency? And then also I create the opportunity for a student to say, here's what they actually could have done to maybe prevent the tragedy, where
Yep.
they can actually extend beyond and say, actually, if they hadn't closed the doors, it wouldn't have sunk as fast. And here's why. I don't know if they've done that yet because I haven't marked the assessment, but I know it was a discussion that somebody said, I've heard that if they hadn't closed the doors, it might have helped. And so, yeah, it just creates really cool opportunities for kids. When you do really organic assessment, it creates really neat opportunities for kids to be part of that.
I think that's fantastic. We know you're grounding in the outcomes and the indicators, which are all inside of the NESD rubric. So you're taking what's there, you're taking those key concepts like buoyancy and Archimedes' principle and the key things that students need to include and making sure that they're fully aware that when you talk about and apply these examples in your experiences, this is the direction that we're going. The idea of just-in-time learning, because I know I was out there, I think one time you're like, "We need this next step. We're looking to" and we'll probably have some future conversations about AI. How do we use AI in a positive way to support that just-in-time learning? But I like that really just-in-time assessment that is organic, that it comes from the student, that there's a moment when you're thinking, yeah, if you could explain that to your younger cousin, that shows me that you know what you're doing. Or when students are thinking, this would be a good question that we could use to show what we know. And so I think those are exciting steps forward that, like you said, if you're locked into a quiz or an exam that has these exact questions, could they do that? Probably. Yeah, they probably could. They have lots of examples and experience to do that. But is that giving them the opportunities to really dig in, show what they know, or to pull those pieces together? So when they do pull those pieces together, I'm thinking I have a couple questions. One is just sort of on the management of how do you manage all of those organic pieces. But I think before we get to that, you've talked about where the questions come from. This would make a good one. Here's what we're going to do. And they're all prepared. So there's not a lot of extra things the students need to do at home to get prepared because they're immersed in the learning. Is it do I write it down as an answer? Do I journal it? Do I use something in EDSB, which is one of the tools that we use? What forms might you get that assessment in?
Well, and that's where one of the really cool things about science is it creates a really neat feedback loop when you're doing experimentation using hypotheses and then conclusion, right? And what really clicked for me when I was doing the Lilladal work and the solo work to some degree is that a hypothesis is really a pre-assessment and a conclusion is a summative assessment, right? And so lots of times we did an exercise lab in Science 8 around human body systems. And every kid by grade 8 has ran and was breathing hard, right? And they know their heart's pounding. So they know that answer, right? Because one of the outcomes is how do bodies respond to stresses like exercise, or one of the indicators, pardon me. They know the answer to that question. What they haven't thought about is why. And as I'm crafting that, we use the EDSB learning story for that. And so I would say, draft your hypothesis, and we talk about a good hypothesis, right? It's not just a prediction, that's part of it. But then share your understanding, right? And so that's that pre-assessment, right? Where I can see, what do you already know? Do you understand that breathing and heart rate are connected? Most don't, which was surprising to me, right? They understood both go up and
Yeah.
they understand both of them are because we're working harder. They didn't know they were connected. So they upload that into Learning Story as their hypothesis. And then when they're done, they upload their conclusion. And so then, and then I'll usually get them to upload the conclusion either into Learning Story as well or into the assignment. Now, I don't mark the hypothesis. That's a formative
Right.
piece for me to look at understanding, but I do mark the conclusion. And part of the conclusion is to reflect on their hypothesis. And so I force that metacognitive piece of, so now do you understand why they're connected? And some of the students like literally wrote in their answer, I don't. Like, I don't understand why
Yeah.
they're connected. And so
Yet.
then we can address that, right? Yeah. And that's that example of that.
Mhm.
Really, that's that enriched beyond, right? Is can you tell me why your breathing rate went up? Can you tell me why your heart rate went up? And what was really cool, we built in rest into the lab. And so that also then became a really nice chance of enrichment. So tell me why this doesn't just drop instantaneously, and showed that really rich understanding of that. But I use either grader or learning story because I want the students to see that I might have been dead wrong, right? Like I had no idea. Great. But now you do. And so what we're starting on now a little bit is then how does our hypothesis guide some of our work, right? So up till now, we've done a lot of cookbook type labs. So more and more now we'll move into you've made a hypothesis. How would you check that? And then the extended piece, of course, is how do you check your own knowledge? So you think you know
Yeah.
something. How do you check that, right? And so that's where EDSB is great because you can use Learning Story and you can use Grader because the power of both of those is just-in-time assessment is it creates lots of cool opportunity for feedback loops, right? You can submit an answer. I can give you some feedback. 100% you can go back and tweak your answer because what's nice is it's not a quiz where it's what are the variables in Archimedes principle. No, you're wrong. Well, if I give you feedback, I'm probably going to tell you the answer. Whereas if it's like, why did the Titanic sink? I can give you some guiding questions. I can give you some I wonders, and you can just keep going. So it becomes more in situ assessment rather than end assessment.
And it's that ongoing conversation to really know what the student knows and have them. I like that you said they need to start to recognize when they know it or that they don't. And then if I don't know it, fair
Yeah.
enough, I haven't learned it yet. Where do I go next to figure out and find what I need to step that up? So you've talked about using the learning story and submitting through there. That would give you video or audio or written formats. When you are, and I'm assuming the learning story or through the grade book where you can upload the evidence would be those moments. So I'm thinking you talked about all sorts of things happening on the go. You see that there's a conversation that's working out. Do you pause at the end of that hour? Because I know you're an administrator, so you don't have a whole lot of extra time in the day, nor do teachers. So there's something that you want to make note of. Do you do that right in the moment? Leave yourself a note? Do you pop it in through to EDSB and add it to the learning story so that you can go back and do that, and that can help inform your professional judgment at the end?
I haven't done that. However, that would work. Often what I'll do is I'll just make a note of it and either, so the language I'll use is I'll be like, this is important for everybody, or this is a one-on-one conversation. So some of that came out of Mama Weok, where, so I had a colleague come into my classroom to do some observing and we were doing some problem, a group problem, very intentional.
Yeah.
I brought her in for that time. And her comment was, there were times when I thought kids were off task till you stopped in and had a one-on-one conversation. And sometimes you stopped everybody. And so we had a good conversation around how do you know when to do that? And it really depends on what the information is. If it's just in time learning, like I said, for example, where we didn't understand displacement method of finding volume, we all needed to talk about that. And in that case, a problem worked. It sometimes might be a stop and a discussion. And that's actually where the Archimedes problem ended with us, was stopping and having that discussion around it. It might be a one-on-one, like what she observed when she was in my classroom, where I stopped with the group. We spent 5 minutes. So for one group, it was 30 seconds. It was literally, you mentioned using AI for just-in-time learning. I'll generate really brief passages using AI that they can then use. Maybe they need to, for example, how do I find density using displacement
Right.
method? Sometimes it was a stop and say, like, here, let's look here. I've even bolded the term for you. Have a look at that. I'll be right back. Whereas with another group, it was that sit down time. So there's all different degrees of what I do when I notice that we need to have a conversation or we need to, or it's that we're ready, right? So sometimes I'll pop into a group and say, I noticed you guys have got off task. Yeah, we've answered the question. Great. I'm going to complicate your thinking just a little bit. The Titanic example was a
Yeah.
great one where they said, oh, it was heavier. Okay. Now that was whole group, but it might be in a small group too, where, oh, we've solved the problem. We did this. Okay, but
Right.
what if I told you the Edmund Fitzgerald was heavier, full of iron ore than the Titanic was full of water, yet the Edmund Fitzgerald floated, right? So
Right.
you start to, so there's all kinds of ways you can intervene with groups. And what the person who was observing my class noticed was it's so differentiated, where this group was having a really, again, my mistake, didn't give her the navigation tool, beginning level conversations, right? Where we're
Yes.
just talking about this beginning level stuff. all the way up to the group who is challenging me, right? Where they're saying, I'm wondering about this, right? Or I'm wondering about this. Or as the example of the Titanic again, I heard once that if they hadn't closed all the doors, it actually wouldn't have sunk like that. Is that true? And then I can say, maybe, right?
Yeah.
That's what James Cameron said. What do you, as someone with scientific knowledge, say? And sometimes students say, what if I'm wrong? Cool, right? I'll tell students there are thousands, if not millions, of scientists who are going to be wrong today. And that's how science works. Let's be wrong, and let's be wrong a lot rather than not try.
The way we're going to find the right answer or find an answer that works is if we've tried and experimented and learned and moved forward. So it's that there isn't, I think sometimes we believe that when writing, I'll just write the story and it'll be perfect the first time. But that's not how writing goes. Authors write and they rewrite and they send it in and they rewrite more and the editors give them feedback. And so that idea, I like the shift in the mindset that it's very growth mindset. There isn't, the worst thing you can do is not engage in it and not try to think about anything. Being wrong is just finding one other way that didn't work and keeping moving forward into what did. So I think that's really exciting.
And that's part 2 of our conversation with Dan. What was your favorite part of the episode? Was it collaboratively thinking through tasks and real-world wonders that take us deeper into the learning? Was it bringing clarity through clear success criteria and the ways clarity supports the evolution towards organic, just-in-time assessment that not only captures authentic learning moments, but also honors the outcome? Or did you appreciate Dan's reminder of resilience and growth mindset? Thank you to Dan for sharing his journey into thinking classrooms. Be sure to join us for episode 3 of NEVoices as we explore Dan's biggest takeaways with thinking classrooms in science. Remember to subscribe to NEVoices for the latest updates, and until next time, thanks for listening. Thank you for joining our community of innovators and changemakers. We hope the conversations and stories have ignited a spark within. We'd like to express our gratitude to our dedicated Northeast educators. Until next time, remember to subscribe to NEVoices and join us on the next episode as we share the stories of learning shaping our future. Thanks for listening.